The moment my daughter-in-law Catherine stepped into the living room, I saw the anger on her face. Her eyes swept across the room, her breath growing quicker, as if she was struggling to hold something back. And then she snapped. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice exploding through the living room and echoing off the walls I'd painted myself 42 years earlier. "This house is too big for one old man. You're moving to assisted living whether you like it or not." I was sitting in my recliner, the same chair where my late wife Dorothy once read bedtime stories to our son Timothy, when Catherine decided to announce my eviction from my own home. 15 minutes after what was supposed to be a family dinner, she was ordering me out of the house Dorothy and I had bought as newlyweds in 1983. "You can't take care of yourself anymore, Frank," my son Timothy added, avoiding my eyes while his wife paced the room like she was already measuring it for new furniture. "Catherine's been researching senior communities. Meadowbrook Manor has an opening next month, the same living room where Dorothy had hosted Christmas mornings for 26 years, where Timothy had opened his college acceptance letter, where we'd celebrated every milestone that mattered. Catherine wanted me gone so she could move into the house that had been our family's foundation for 4 decades. This house is wasted on someone who spends all day watching television," she continued, her arms crossed, her voice rising. "Timothy and I need space for the family we're planning. You're just taking up room. Taking up room in my own home, as if I were an old piece of furniture that no longer matched her decor." In that moment, I heard Dorothy's voice as clearly as if she were beside me. "Frank, if anyone ever tries to take away everything we built together, you show them exactly what we've been protecting all these years." I understood perfectly what Catherine was really saying. What she didn't know was what I had been documenting in the basement workshop ever since she first started talking about wasted space and downsizing. Catherine thought she had cornered a helpless widower. She had no idea what 42 years of homeownership had taught me, or what I had been hiding in the basement since the day she married my son. It had really started 8 months earlier, when Catherine first suggested that I should consider my housing options for the future. 8 months before the living room confrontation, Catherine had started bringing real estate brochures to our Sunday dinners with what she called practical conversations about my long-term housing needs. That particular evening, I remember her spreading glossy pamphlets across Dorothy's dining room table, while Timothy served coffee from the pot Dorothy had bought for our first anniversary. "Frank's been rattling around in this big house all alone," Catherine explained to her mother Evelyn, who'd started attending our family dinners uninvited. 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, full basement, huge yard. It's really more space than one person needs. When she mentioned the market value had increased significantly, I noticed her eyes brighten for just a moment. I should have realized then that this wasn't just family concern. This was financial opportunity. "And it's becoming a maintenance burden," Timothy added, though I'd never asked him for help with any repairs. "The gutters need cleaning. The driveway needs resealing. The basement probably has moisture issues." None of that was accurate. I'd maintained our house meticulously for 4 decades. The moisture issues were Catherine's invention after she'd noticed the dehumidifier I ran in my workshop. "Frank, empty nesters often find that smaller living spaces actually increase their quality of life," Evelyn said, reviewing senior living catalogs like she was shopping for furniture. "These communities offer social activities, meal services, transportation assistance." The way she said empty nesters made it sound like a medical condition requiring immediate treatment. I watched Catherine take notes about my supposed maintenance failures while Evelyn documented my social isolation needs, creating a case file for why I should abandon the home Dorothy and I had spent decades perfecting. The next day, while I was checking my mail, Catherine made sure our neighbor Mrs. Henderson could hear her talking to Evelyn on my front porch. "He still thinks he can maintain this house?" Catherine laughed, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "He can't even keep track of his own mail. Yesterday I found 3 unopened bills on his kitchen counter." She was lying. I'd never left bills unopened. But Mrs. Henderson was listening, and Catherine knew it. Was this really my family? When did my house become something they needed to manage instead of the home they'd always been welcome to visit? Later, loading dishes into the dishwasher Dorothy had insisted we splurge on in 1998, I realized what was happening. They weren't planning my housing future. They were planning my housing removal. Most people would have confronted them directly, but something in me chose to stay quiet and prepare. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner was the first time they tried to establish grounds for taking my home. What Catherine didn't realize was that her father-in-law wasn't just Frank, retired electrical inspector who'd spent 38 years checking building codes and wiring systems for the county. I'd always been careful about documentation, always kept detailed records, always understood the importance of evidence when people questioned your property rights or competence. The conversation that changed everything happened 12 weeks before the living room confrontation when I returned from grocery shopping to find Catherine, Timothy, and someone introduced as Marcus from Meadowbrook Manor walking through my house with evaluation clipboards. Dad, Marcus conducts home safety assessments that help families understand when elderly relatives need assisted living support, Timothy said, not quite meeting my eyes. We've been concerned about some maintenance issues, and he can provide professional recommendations. I recognized the setup immediately. This wasn't a safety assessment. This was a property evaluation disguised as elder care. Marcus stepped forward with inspection materials and documentation that seemed designed to find problems rather than assess safety. Mr. Frank, these evaluations measure home maintenance capacity, fall risk factors, and independent living sustainability. I stayed calm and cooperative, but I noticed several irregularities in their approach. The questions focused on problems rather than solutions. The inspections seemed designed to document hazards rather than address them. Based on preliminary assessment, we're seeing patterns consistent with maintenance decline and safety risks, Marcus explained to Timothy and Catherine as if I weren't standing right there. I'd recommend comprehensive evaluation for assisted living transition. Something about their coordination reminded me of building inspectors who came looking for violations instead of safety compliance. They weren't assessing my home's safety. They were manufacturing evidence of my inability to maintain it. The next week, Catherine deliberately unplugged my basement dehumidifier during a visit, then returned 3 days later claiming she was worried about the dampness down there. Frank, this is exactly what we mean about maintenance issues, she said, running her finger along a perfectly normal condensation line. You're forgetting basic things like climate control. What if this leads to mold? What if you fall on wet steps? She was creating hazards to justify removing me from my own home. But what I discovered next would change everything. That evening, I sat in my basement workshop, the same space where Dorothy and I had planned every home improvement for 4 decades, and reviewed documents I'd found hidden in Timothy's jacket during their assessment visit. Property transfer research with my home's current market value, $420,000. Real estate consultation records showing they'd obtained appraisals without my knowledge. Assisted living facility. Contracts with my name already filled in on admission paperwork. Subject property represents significant asset currently underutilized by elderly single occupant, Catherine had written in notes I discovered. Market analysis indicates optimal timing for property transfer. Subject shows declining maintenance capacity consistent with assisted living necessity. Frank's attachment to oversized family home prevents rational downsizing decisions, Timothy had added in his handwriting. Professional intervention required to overcome emotional resistance to appropriate senior housing transition. They'd been researching property transfer laws that would give married children legal authority over elderly parents' real estate decisions. Plans designed to justify taking control of my home for family financial optimization. But Catherine had miscalculated something crucial about her target. What she didn't know was that Dorothy and I had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this scenario after watching her brother lose his home to similar family manipulation. I adjusted my work light and looked at the documents I'd kept secured in my workshop filing cabinet. Complete home inspection reports showing perfect maintenance. Independent safety evaluation confirming full compliance with all building codes. Legal documentation proving my complete competence and property ownership. Dorothy's detailed instructions about protecting our home. Property ownership documentation that explicitly prevented family members from making unilateral housing decisions. A will that specified my right to remain in our home as long as I maintained it properly. By the time I finished reviewing everything, I realized the truth. Catherine didn't want me in assisted living for my safety. She wanted our house for her future. They didn't know that Dorothy and I had updated all property documents after her cancer diagnosis. Every line of that paperwork would soon become their worst nightmare. Dorothy would never forgive this betrayal. Catherine made her fatal mistake when she assumed I would simply accept their housing recommendations without investigating the legal mechanisms behind their sudden concern for my welfare. Instead, I'd spent 12 weeks documenting their manipulation while building my own evidence file. Frank's not going to just surrender his property because they say it's necessary, I'd told the attorney Dorothy had insisted we retain, Richard Mitchell. But Catherine doesn't need to know I'm building a property protection case. What Catherine didn't know was that I'd spent 38 years as an electrical inspector, which meant I understood building codes, property law, and construction fraud better than she realized. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man. They forgot I'd spent 4 decades identifying code violations and fraudulent inspection reports. Richard looked at me and said quietly, "Frank, what they're attempting isn't just inappropriate. It's elder abuse disguised as housing assistance." My son's housing plan had become a systematic attack on my property rights and personal autonomy. The evidence stacked up quickly. Catherine had built her case on manufactured problems, but she'd made legal errors that any experienced property professional would identify immediately. The assisted living contracts violate informed consent requirements, Richard confirmed. Marcus's credentials don't match state licensing for elder care assessments. Catherine had attempted property theft against someone whose career had been devoted to identifying building fraud and inspection manipulation. Anyone who's ever been underestimated because of their age knows exactly why I kept fighting. I knew Catherine's scheme was finished when Richard contacted the state elder abuse hotline and property fraud division. The investigation expanded rapidly once we'd reported systematic real estate manipulation involving falsified safety assessments. "Frank, we've identified a comprehensive property theft conspiracy," Detective Laura explained during our meeting. "Fraudulent safety evaluations, unauthorized property appraisals, systematic preparation for real estate control through manipulated housing placement." I kept asking myself, when did my son's wife start seeing our family home as her inheritance opportunity instead of my lifetime residence? Catherine had collaborated with Timothy and Evelyn to create safety documentation targeting not just my housing, but my fundamental right to control my own property decisions. Detective Laura said they'd discovered similar schemes involving other elderly homeowners targeted through housing manipulation. I spread evidence across Richard's desk, Catherine's correspondence with real estate agents, Timothy's market research calculations, Marcus's fraudulent safety reports that contradicted my actual home condition. "The assisted living placement represents systematic property theft," Richard noted, "creating false housing necessity while gaining unauthorized access to elderly homeowners' real estate assets." Catherine didn't understand that manipulating property ownership requires legitimate legal authority and ethical oversight, neither of which her conspiracy possessed. What truly sealed her fate was discovering they'd already made deposits at assisted living facilities, expecting to complete my housing transfer within weeks. That was their first mistake, but not their last. That week, I observed Catherine's confidence crumbling as their property fraud scheme encountered legitimate oversight. Richard had reported Marcus's irregular credentials to state licensing authorities. Real property law specialists began questioning their assessment methods. "The State Housing Board is demanding a full audit of Marcus's evaluations," Timothy mentioned during a panicked phone call, his voice tight with anxiety. "They're reviewing every case he's handled involving elderly homeowner transitions." "What kind of audit?" I asked, knowing exactly what regulatory investigation was dismantling their conspiracy. "They want to interview all his clients," Catherine added, her professional composure finally cracking. "They want to verify the housing necessity of every placement recommendation he's made." Evelyn broke down crying when they received the first violation letter. "Frank, the state board has suspended Marcus's practice," she sobbed during what she thought was a private call. "They're investigating him for issuing fraudulent housing evaluations. What if they find out about the deposits we made at Meadowbrook?" "Marcus isn't returning our calls," Catherine whispered frantically to Timothy outside my house during what they thought was a routine visit. "The licensing board has opened a criminal investigation. If they trace this back to us, we could face property fraud charges." Timothy stopped answering calls from assisted living facilities demanding explanations for their falsified safety documentation. Real estate agents called saying the property research didn't match homeowner consent requirements. Meadowbrook Manor left increasingly aggressive voicemails about their $8,000 deposit for my confirmed placement. And if you think the housing fraud was bad, what happened next would have made anyone question their own family. When licensing investigators began calling to verify my actual housing safety, Catherine's explanations became desperate. "There must be some mistake," she told the investigator. "Marcus assured us the evaluation was comprehensive and legitimate. The whole plan is collapsing." I overheard Evelyn telling someone on the phone late one evening. "Frank's independent inspection came back perfect. The state knows Marcus was issuing fraudulent evaluations. We're looking at criminal charges if they connect us to this scheme." Timothy started researching whether they could withdraw their facility deposits without triggering additional scrutiny. Catherine began suggesting they might need to take a vacation until this investigation concludes. Catherine was learning that property fraud creates legal consequences that experienced investigators follow directly to prosecution. What confirmed their complete panic was when they decided to force my housing decision by confronting me directly in my living room. The night before the living room confrontation, I sat in my basement workshop reviewing the comprehensive evidence file that would expose Catherine's property theft scheme and protect my home permanently. I pulled out Dorothy's final letter, written during her last week in hospice care. "Frank, our house is more than property. It's proof that we built something lasting together. If anyone ever tries to take that away from you, remember that you know every wire, every beam, every foundation stone in this place. Use that knowledge to protect what we created." The evidence revealed calculated manipulation that transcended housing concern. Catherine had been planning to steal my home while disguising it as elder care, all justified through manufactured safety concerns and fraudulent professional evaluations. Catherine's scheme represents systematic property theft involving housing fraud, Detective Laura had explained during our coordination meeting. Fraudulent safety assessments, unauthorized property research, conspiracy to gain real estate control. Some electrical inspectors spend their careers understanding exactly how property fraud works and how to protect homeowners from systematic exploitation. Tomorrow, Catherine would walk into my living room thinking she was completing my housing eviction. She didn't know she was walking into a comprehensive property theft investigation. What she also didn't know was what I'd been building in my basement workshop for the past 8 months. The confrontation came when Catherine, Timothy, and Evelyn gathered in my living room expecting to finalize arrangements for my immediate assisted living placement. "Frank, we've made the difficult decision that's best for everyone," Catherine began, settling into Dorothy's chair with obvious authority. "Meadowbrook Manor has confirmed your placement for next month. We've arranged moving services to help with the transition. The house needs significant work that you can't manage anymore," Timothy added, presenting documents for institutions I'd never agreed to consider. "Marcus's evaluation confirmed that independent living is no longer safe for you here." What hurt most was realizing Timothy had been secretly signing paperwork behind my back, believing Catherine's lies about my declining condition. He genuinely thought he was protecting me by helping her steal my home. Sometimes I'd catch him looking uncertain when Catherine made her most aggressive claims about my incompetence. Like, part of him didn't want to believe what she was saying, but he always ended up supporting her anyway. I looked at them calmly from my recliner, the same chair where Dorothy had held our grandson before Catherine decided he didn't need to visit his grandfather anymore. "Before we discuss any placement," I said quietly, "there's something important you should know about your property theft scheme." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the legal documents Richard had prepared, placed them on Dorothy's coffee table between us. The independent property inspection showing perfect maintenance, the state licensing board's report confirming Marcus's fraudulent credentials, the property theft investigation file documenting their systematic manipulation of housing evaluations. "Catherine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you forgot that your father-in-law spent 38 years identifying building fraud and inspection manipulation." Her face went completely white as she read the legal papers. "Dad, what is this?" Timothy's voice cracked as he picked up the property inspection report. When did you get this evaluation?" How could he ask me that, after everything they'd planned to steal from me? "The housing evaluations you fabricated contradict my actual property condition," I continued. "The assisted living placement you arranged was based on fraudulent documentation." "That's impossible," Catherine snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. "Marcus is a licensed professional. He wouldn't falsify anything. And I've been working with law enforcement since you first brought Marcus into my house. Timothy tried to gather the documents, but his hands were shaking too badly to manage the papers. Evelyn was reading the property fraud report with growing alarm. Detective Laura was already approaching my front door, her badge visible through the window. "But there's one more thing you should see," I said, standing slowly. "Follow me to the basement." "No!" Catherine suddenly screamed, her mask finally dropping completely. "This house was supposed to be ours. You're too old to appreciate it. We have plans. We have a future. We deserve this more than some old man living in the past." There it was. The truth she'd been hiding behind elder care concerns and safety assessments. What finally ended their scheme was the moment they realized what I'd been hiding in Dorothy's workshop for the past 8 months. In the basement, I led them to Dorothy's workshop, where I'd spent 42 years maintaining our home. On the workbench sat 43 banker's boxes filled with documents, photographs, and recordings. I have audio recordings, 13 hours of conversations, each labeled, time-stamped, and backed up on the flash drive Richard told me to keep off-site, I said, opening the first box. "Every conversation you've had in this house for the past 8 months. Every phone call you made about property values, every meeting with real estate agents, every plan to steal my home. Complete maintenance records for 42 years, I continued, opening another box. Every repair, every improvement, every code inspection. This house isn't declining. It's been meticulously maintained by someone who knows exactly what he's doing. Security camera footage from 4 hidden cameras Dorothy and I installed after her brother lost his house," I added, pointing to a laptop displaying time-stamped video files, including the footage of you unplugging my dehumidifier and returning to create your fake moisture problem. I touched the wooden beam where Dorothy had carved her initials with my first hammer when we'd finished the basement workshop in 1985. This house wasn't just property. It was our lifetime of love made real. "But there's one recording that might interest you most, Catherine," I said, clicking play on a specific audio file. "It's your mother, Evelyn, 3 weeks ago, talking to her friend Louise about how, once we get Frank out and sell the house, Catherine gets her share immediately, and I get mine for helping make it happen." Catherine's face went white as her mother's voice filled the basement, revealing that even Evelyn had been calculating her cut of my stolen home. Catherine stared at the evidence of her own conspiracy spread across Dorothy's workbench. Justice came quietly when the district attorney filed comprehensive charges against Catherine, Timothy, and Marcus 10 weeks after the basement revelation. All 3 faced multiple felony counts related to elder abuse, property fraud, and conspiracy to commit real estate theft. The defendants systematically targeted an elderly homeowner through fabricated housing assessments, the prosecutor announced. They face 12 to 18 years in state prison. Marcus's housing credentials were exposed as completely fraudulent. Catherine's real estate ambitions destroyed their marriage within months. Timothy lost his job when his employer learned about the property fraud charges. 6 months later, Timothy knocked on my front door on a quiet Sunday evening. We sat on Dorothy's front porch, watching the sunset over the neighborhood we'd called home for 4 decades. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice thick with shame. "I let Catherine convince me that you couldn't take care of this place anymore. I forgot that you built half of it with your own hands. Your mother always said this house had good bones," I told him. "She also said that homes protect the people who protect them. I wish Dorothy had lived to see him choose our family home over his wife's real estate schemes. Sometimes the quietest justice comes from simply remembering who you are when others choose to forget." Catherine calculated that her elderly father-in-law would be easy prey for housing manipulation disguised as elder care, but she'd forgotten the most important detail about her target. When Catherine screamed, "Get out!" she thought she was evicting a helpless old man from property she could claim. She didn't know I understood building codes better than she understood property law. My basement workshop wasn't what she expected. My basement workshop was justice served through proper legal channels, systematic documentation, and complete protection of the home Dorothy and I built together. Her housing scheme lasted 8 months. The criminal charges will follow her for 18 years. And every morning I wake up in the bedroom Dorothy and I shared for 40 years, grateful that some homes can survive people who mistake aging for opportunity. She tried to steal my house. Instead, she lost her freedom. People forget that old houses hold more than memories. They hold the truth. And men who've spent 40 years protecting their homes know exactly how to use that truth when someone threatens everything they've built. Justice stays quiet until it needs to speak. Then it speaks loud enough for everyone to hear.